is in Moscow, the capital city of Russia. And we have the honor of having with us Dmitry Babich. He is a well-known political analyst and a journalist. He specializes in geopolitics and Russia's place in the world. Welcome to Reason, the new Indians platform where we get to the reason behind the issues that concern you. Welcome, Mr. Babich.
Hello, nice to see you here in Moscow.
Let me begin this conversation with the most obvious question. The war in Ukraine. Ukraine has been claiming that it has retaken over 2,300 square miles of territory which was taken over by Russia in the last few months. Tell our audience that the offensive that President Zelensky's troops have launched, has it forced Russia to retreat from territories, for example, in Kharkiv region? Why has this happened?
Well, I think it's very important for our viewers to understand the moral side of this whole affair, which is perceived in Russia as a tragedy. I mean, whomever you talk to, the huge majority of people perceive it as a tragedy. The only usual mistake that foreigners make is that they think that the war started on February 24th this year. No. I mean, check your news lines. The war started in 2014 when a group of people openly supported by the United States and the European Union, with John McCain making speeches before them, with European leaders such as the Foreign Minister of Germany making speeches before them. These people killed 38 policemen, maimed a few hundred more policemen, and seized power in Ukraine violently. It was not a peaceful revolution, it was a real obvious coup d'etat, and I'm not the only one to say it. I mean, check the real sources. George Friedman, from the American think tank, which is obviously well known and connected to the special services, he called it the most obvious coup in human history, because this story, as you might remember, continued for 5 months. 5 months of open violence against people, against police, against the government, and how these people seized power. I mean, only the Western media can believe it. When they entered the building of the parliament next hour started to pass completely different legislation from the one it had been passing before. So the Ukraine was in the hands of a very radical nationalist movement since 2014, since February 2014. And the problem was that the West promised to negotiate a compromise, and the seizure of power happened one day, even less than one day, after they signed an agreement. The ousted president, Viktor Yanukovych, and the two leaders of the opposition, Klitschko and Yatsenyuk, both criminals in power now, they signed the agreement that there would be no violence, that they retreat from their positions in the center of the city, that police also retreats, and the elections would be held later that year. So Yanukovych fulfilled his part of the agreement. But these guys started an attack, burnt alive several people in the party that supports Yanukovych in their headquarters in Minsk, and seized power. And since then, the tragedy started. As you know, 15,000 people died between 2014 and 2022, most of them in Donbass, the Russian-speaking eastern part of Ukraine. So what happened in February this year was an aggravation of the war, or I would say Russia became involved in the war openly, but it was not the start of the war, right?
I get that, but my question...
I will come back to your question. Of course, it is difficult to say because there is a fog of war. So in order to answer your question precisely, what's going on and who is losing, who is winning. I would have to be there, and I would have to be in the boots of both the Russian and Ukrainian commanders. But I can tell you that...
But is it not true that a lot of areas, for example, Donbass, you yourself mentioned that the Russian troops moved in and they liberated this zone which was under what Russia has been saying, neo-Nazis.
The nationalist government, yes, let's call them nationalists.
Now, I'm asking, the advances that Russian troops had made in the last several months, are we now seeing Russia retreating? What has happened in Kharkiv region?
Okay.
I understand the logic that, you know, Russia has been in a war since 2014, even though we didn't call it war, or we didn't call...
Russia was not in a war. You would not feel it, especially inside the country. There were volunteers who went to, you know, like people who helped Tamil tigers, for Indians to understand.
Yes.
It was like, you know, people Tamils who went to help Tamil tigers on the Sivan. Of course, there was a certain amount of arms and equipment basically given to the people there so that they could defend themselves. But Russia was not at war. There were no regiments, battalions, you know, groups of special people coming there. But I understand what you're asking. Let me give you the figures so that you can understand what we're talking about. The so-called pro-Russian separatists who started their rebellion against the illegal government in Kiev in 2014, they control, in February this year, when the situation aggravated, they controlled 3% of the Ukrainian territory.
Okay.
Now, when the Russian troops moved in, trying to secure Donbass, unfortunately, we haven't yet been able to do it. It's still bombarded.
Why hasn't Russia been able to take it completely?
I will give you the figures and then I will come back to that. Well, this is the problem. The Ukrainian army is much stronger than Russia expected it to be.
So are we saying that Ukraine, which is a much smaller country, which has a much smaller economy and is more stronger than Russia?
Well, remember they've got, officially they've got $15 billion worth of Western weapons. And American and British instructors have been teaching them for 8 years. So militarily, it's a totalitarian state.
So are you then saying that Russia did not anticipate this? There was an intelligence failure for Russia not to know this?
I understand. Let's move step by step, or we will get confused. The Ukrainian government, the nationalist government, which is now in Kiev, it's a totalitarian state. So, as you know from history, totalitarian states are sometimes very strong militarily. They are not strong economically, people are not happy, but they're strong militarily. So, since 2014, a huge part of Ukrainian budget was spent on the military. They have been bombarding Donetsk, which is a city of 2 million people, from a short distance. You know, they were stopped right in the outskirts of the city. They have been bombarding for 8 years. Every day, 2 or 3 or 4 people died. And they have built very strong fortifications which they can defend. And the best Ukrainian troops were sent there, pressuring the city. So there was a standoff that continued for 8 years, almost without change. So when the Russian troops moved in, they could not push the Ukrainian army away from the city because the fortifications are so strong. You would have to lose thousands of soldiers trying to get them out of there. But Russia, Russia, just a second. Yeah. But so I started it from the beginning. But the territory which the so-called separatists controlled was 3% of the Ukrainian territory. Russian troops moved in. Why? In other areas also, because you cannot only protect Donetsk and stop, you know. The Ukrainian army is huge. You have to strike it at various places. And also people were suffering, you know, from persecution in various parts of Ukraine. So Russia took about 10% of the Ukrainian territory, Kherson region and part of Kharkiv region, to the north of Donbass. So out of this territory, 10% of the Ukrainian territory, we lost about 1% because of this counteroffensive. But let me tell you this, the main tragedy for me is not territory, the main tragedy is the people. The reason why Russia was so much opposed to this new nationalist government in Ukraine since 2014 was because Russians basically faced the same fate as Hindus in Pakistan or under this government. The Russian language was almost exterminated. It was not, I mean, you would hear it in the streets. Most of the people still use Russian at home, but it is not taught at schools. Exams are only in Ukrainian. And even though these languages are very close, I mean, you say Kharkiv, as the Western media say, we say Kharkov. That's the whole difference. Okay. If you replace O by E, you would get Ukrainian. Oh, but okay. The problem is that all Ukrainians speak Russian, sometimes so well that we cannot, in 90% of the cases, we cannot tell them from ourselves. But it's very difficult for us to speak Ukrainian because it's a dialect of Russian. So if you know the literary language, it's very difficult to speak the dialect. And of course, it's difficult to pass the exams.
But these people who are in the Ukrainian army fighting Russian troops, they are also, if you...
they're Russians, ethnic
they're
Russians, a lot of them.
But they are not on your side. They are not on Russia's side today.
Well, first, please remember, 30 years have passed since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So a new generation was raised. When we interview these people as journalists, they suddenly say, oh, I was forced, I didn't want to kill Russian soldiers. Look, I speak Russian, look, my family is Russian. But first, they cannot refuse to go to the army, because if you refuse, you end up in jail, and your family may have huge problems. People are not allowed to leave the country. Men are not allowed to leave the country. If you look at the Ukrainian refugees, they are all women and children, and sometimes very old people. Everyone until the age of 60 has to be ready for the army. In Russia, we don't have this mobilization because we are not a totalitarian state. You know what is very important about this war? The West says that these are authoritarian regimes against democracies. We are authoritarian, China is authoritarian, they are democracies. Well, if you read...
They also include Prime Minister Modi in the list now.
Yes, everyone whom they don't like. The problem is that if they read their own textbooks on politics, on political science, they would find out that there is something worse than authoritarian regimes. There are totalitarian regimes.
Yes.
The West now is totalitarian. What is the difference between authoritarian and totalitarian? In an authoritarian regime, if you disagree with the government, and that happens very often in Russia, you can do your job, you know, you can be in arts, in sports, and just stay silent on politics. If you live in a totalitarian country, you have to speak out, you have to take a position, and if you take the position different from the government, you are out. That's what happened to our music conductor, Valery Gergiev in Munich. He didn't say anything about this military operation, he didn't say, they came up to him and they said, now tell us, what's your position on the war in Ukraine? Are you against Putin? You're not against Putin? You're still silent? Out. So they are totalitarian. We are, okay, they may call us whatever they want, but if you spend here a little more time, you will see that in Russia we still have freedom of thought, freedom of expression. Not always we have, you know, like a developed party system, a competitive party system, but there is freedom of expression, something that doesn't exist in the West anymore.
Well, thank you so much for this enlightening discussion on the war in Ukraine. Hoping to do more interviews with you for the New Indian. Thank you.